Thank you all for coming along today. We're lucky this afternoon that we have a few scientists with us to talk about humpback whales in the Kimberley. First up, we're going to have Michele Thums from Ames, and followed by Chandra Salgado-Kent from Curtin University. And they're talking about one of the WAMSI research projects from the Kimberley Marine Research Program, and this one's about looking at humpback whale use and of the Kimberley region, how that's changed over time, and how we can best monitor and understand this population. I'll hand over to Michele.
Thanks very much, Kelly. So yeah, thanks for joining me this afternoon to hear about modelling the spatial distribution of humpback whales in the Kimberley. I'd like to acknowledge all the co-authors that you see listed there. So a bit of background. About 33,000 humpback whales migrate annually from their feeding grounds in Antarctica to give birth and breed in the Kimberley region. And the same happens on the east coast of Australia. And this is the longest migration of any mammal. The northerly migration occurs in July and August, and it's thought to occur further offshore, as shown in the red arrows on this map, and the southern migration occurring closer to shore and shown in the blue arrows on the map. The calving occurs between the Lacepede Islands and Camden Sound, which is shown in the dotted box on the map here. And the animals aggregate in these areas that are circled in white on the map on the right. At Pender Bay, do I have a pointer? Or can I use the arrow?
You can use the mouse.
Oh, yeah. Is that? Oh, maybe I'll.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So here at Pender Bay, Camden Sound, and this Frost and Tasmanian Shoals area. So the population is thought to be recovering after whaling in the mid-1900s caused population collapse. They're currently listed as vulnerable, although some of you might have heard that the population has recovered to the extent where some have suggested that they get delisted. So we know quite a lot about this population already. We know about their migratory routes and the aggregation areas, as I've just explained. We know something about the general timing of migration. We know about the calving areas, although you'll see I've put a question mark here, as some of you might have heard that a PhD student that I co-supervise, Lynn Irvine, has documented significant numbers of newborn calves at Exmouth. So this area, of course, is 1,000 kilometres south of the recognised calving area in the Kimberley, as I've just showed you. We know something about the approximate distribution. And again, I've put a question mark here. I was just talking with Rob about this, getting a lot of sightings of humpback whales as far north as Wadair in the Northern Territory. So we also have a lot of information and knowledge from the extensive aerial and vessel line transect surveys that have been conducted over the last 2 decades, mostly for the oil and gas industry, for environmental impact assessments. But for a lot of this data, there's been limited analysis and no synthesis. Thus, we have really a limited understanding of the habitat requirements. And importantly, we have no quantitative assessment of the important areas that these animals use. So management in the Kimberley is really hampered by a lack of integrated approaches to acquisition of the data and to quantitative analysis of the data. So the objectives of this WAMSI project were to amass all the existing survey data for humpback whales and develop a model of spatial distribution and abundance in the Kimberley, to quantify the important areas, to understand the drivers of distribution, and to advise on future monitoring of humpbacks, especially in the Lallangarum Camden Sound Marine Park. So we've been working away for a couple of years now, trying to compile all these data, and I don't expect you to read all these tables. It's really just to show you that the data is massive and very extensive. And so we have aerial surveys, we have vessel surveys, we have surveys from systematic sampling, and we have surveys from tourist operators. So a lot of different data types that we've compiled here. And all told, this data encompasses 13 years, 3 decades, 585 days of sampling, and more than 10,000 pods were observed over this period. And here's a spatial representation of what this data looks like. And so we've actually had more data come in since I've made these maps. We've got a lot of data from Woodside, 4 years of data, and we got some more data from a tourist operator. So it's not represented on these maps, but On the left is all the aerial survey data. Each of the coloured dots represents a different survey year, and on the right, the vessel survey data. And so I probably should just briefly explain how these surveys are done for those of you who don't know. So for aerial surveys, the plane flies along a designated path, and you can see that underlying pattern in the data there. And there's observers on either side of the plane, and they look out to the horizon and they count all the whales that they see. Then they also measure the angular or the angles to the animals and the height from the ground and the position of the plane, and then later use this data to calculate the perpendicular distance of the animal from the plane, and also to project the actual position of the whale. And so for the vessel survey data, it's similar, of course, except it's undertaken on a boat and in a much slower speed. So the methods that we've used to model these data, there's two different methods, and the methods are chosen based on the input data. So the preferred method is density surface modelling, where we have the right inputs, and density surface modelling is a combination of distance sampling and generalised additive models. And then these models are used to predict density, so counts or abundance of the animals in relation to environmental covariates. So in distance sampling, we're able to account for detectability because it's understood that not all animals in the survey region can be detected in the same way. So that's represented in this plot here. So here's the probability of detection on the y-axis and distance from the observer on the x-axis there. So we know that at zero distance, we have a probability of 1 of detecting an animal, and the further the animal is away from the observer, the lower our probability of observing it. So by fitting this detection function, we can then account for the animals that were mixed. And importantly, observer level covariates that were observed with each observation, such as the sea state, the size of the pod, they also affect detectability. And so these can be taken into account as well. Distance sampling also accounts for effort. So if we know something about the length of the transects, and in fact in density surface modelling we break these up into smaller segments, and then we associate the covariates with each of those segments. But importantly, we can have this, this measure of effort along the survey path. So distance and effort are crucial to be able to implement density surface modelling. And where we don't have those inputs, as we have with a lot of the surveys that didn't have systematic sampling, we can use this other approach called species distribution modelling, and there's lots of different methods, and we've used the maximum entropy method. So here, instead of modelling the counts or abundance, we model presence-absence, and then we can predict the probability of occurrence. And so for both of these response variables, we use a set of environmental predictors. In this case, we chose a priori, depth, slope, rugosity, and sea surface temperature, and we modelled the pods of the females and calves separately. I'm only going to show you that for the species distribution model today. So I'll jump straight into the results. And so I'm going to present the density surface model results first. And so I can't show you all the results, of course, because there's so many different data sets as I've showed you. And I am in the process of compiling it all, but we're still working on that. So I'm going to start off just showing you the Centre for Whale Research's aerial survey data. So first up, we've got the 2006 aerial data. And so the top generalised additive model, out of all those predictors I mentioned, only selected a model with the smooth on X and Y, so the spatial coordinates, and sea surface temperature. And 14% deviance was explained by this model, and most of it explained by the smooth on X and Y. And that can be seen by the large error bars on sea surface temperature there, but in general we have a declining abundance with sea surface temperature. So these plots are the partial residual plots, so they show the residuals, so not the actual response, but you can interpret them as if it is showing the response. And so here these plots are a bit difficult to read, but here you can see our survey path, and this is a heat map, so white is the hottest areas, so this is where density was highest, and I'll show you that in another map. It's a bit easier to read. So if you focus now on the maps on the left, so here are the spatial predictions for that model that had the smooth on the X and Y coordinate and sea surface temperature. And so what we can see is that we had the highest density was predicted in this area offshore of Camden Sound and here in Pender Bay. So the map on the right shows the same map of the predictions from this model, and it's just overlaid with the survey path in red and the raw counts of the data. So these are shown as a bubble plot in black, and so the size of the bubble represents the size of the pod. So it's just to show you how representative that sampling was in that year. So the model predicted 372 whales, shown a confidence interval there, and the raw count of the whales was 238. And of course, as we expect, the model predicts more because we're accounting for the uneven detectability across the survey region because of this, the way that detectability changes with distance from the survey line, and because of these observer level covariates that I talked about, like sea state and size of the pod. So of course I'm not saying that there are 372 whales in this area, because I haven't accounted for the whales that we haven't seen. This is a marine mammal. They're not always available at the surface to be counted. They spend a lot of their time underwater where they're not available, so we haven't accounted for the availability bias here. And of course, this prediction, this abundance estimate also depends on whether this survey, was representative, whether the survey was representative of the study region. Okay, so moving on to the 2007 aerial surveys now. So the generalised additive model for this year of data included all the covariates that we threw at it and accounted for 28% of the deviance. So with all of the covariates, depth, sea surface temperature, slope and rugosity, they all, abundance declined with all of these covariates. Even though slope was retained in the top model, you can see there's quite a lot of variation, but so maybe some evidence that there is some declining relationship here as well. Here are the predictions from this model. So again, as we saw before, the plot on the right just shows the survey line, the track line in red, and the counts of the whales that are shown as size of the pod in the bubble. And so we see with this one a little bit different because it was done in a different region and in a different way. So we're getting this area offshore of the Buccaneer Peninsula there being important. Here, Pender Bay, and offshore of Cape Levesque. We're also getting a lot of estimated abundance here, which might be the model over-extrapolating because, as you can see, there's not as much effort there. And this is why it's important to overlay the raw data in order to interpret what you're seeing. So 1,280 whales were estimated in that area. Now here are the results from the 2008 aerial survey. And so just like in 2006, the top model chose the smooth on X and Y and sea surface temperature only. And we can see with sea surface temperature, this time it's not a linear relationship, but generally a declining relationship. So abundance declines with sea surface temperature, and we're getting a peak at around 24 to 25 degrees C. And so I'll just show again the spatial predictions from this model. And this time we see that we're getting a hot spot off North Head there, offshore of Pender Bay, and a little bit around Cape Levesque, which again might be some model over-extrapolation. And then a smaller prediction offshore of Pender Bay there, and here down at Gordon Bay. So what you'll notice here is that the model this time has predicted a lot less whales than were actually counted in the raw data. So this is a problem. And so what I did was then to look at my detection function. So this is the probability of detection, as I showed before, on the y-axis against distance on the x-axis, and on the left is the raw distance data. and I've simply just fitted a half normal detection function there, and you can see it's fitting very poorly. And it's fitting poorly because these detections don't decline with distance, as we saw previously. I'll just flick back to that plot. So this is what we expect, that it declines with distance from the observer. And so what we saw was not that. So you read from this plot then that at around 6,000 metres, the detection probability was similar to what we saw at 2,000 metres. So that's not really, doesn't really make sense. And so when I looked into the data, it seemed that the distances were rounded, especially at these larger distances. And so we needed to account for that rounding. And also what you might notice is that the probability of detection at 0 is very low. And I said before, normally you would want a detection probability of 1 at 0 distance because the whales are closest to you at that point. Again, pointing to something being wrong. And in this case, when I asked Curt, who was the one that collected the data, he said, no, well, we couldn't see underneath the plane, so we couldn't see at 0 distance. So then what I did, I tried to fix this by left truncating the data. So basically taking off these distances where they couldn't see under the plane and then trying to bin some of these data that were rounded at the high distances. And so this is what I ended up with. It has a great function that's fitting a lot better, but it's still not perfect. You can see the observed compared to the expected there is still not quite right, and overall getting a really low probability of detection. So I need to do a bit more work on this data set, but what I can say is that these spatial predictions are more or less correct because the detection function is really used for the abundance estimate. So the spatial predictions will remain more or less the same. It's just our abundance estimate that needs some work. So in summary, we've found these hotspots at Pender Bay, Camden Sound, the Tasmanian Shoals area. Sea surface temperature was a really strong driver, 24 to 25 degrees Celsius is preferred. And our next steps, and in fact what we're working on now, is to incorporate all these data into one model. And we hope to predict density per month to examine all seasonal changes in distribution. Now I want to show you the results of the distribution models where we had presence-absence as the response. So here are the results from one of these surveys. These are Coastwatch aerial survey data in 1993. There's a lot on this slide, so I might just quickly explain the format of the slide before I explain the results, because the next 3 slides are going to look exactly the same. So along the top I've got 3 maps, and there's 3 because we analysed all the data together, then we analysed just the pods where there were females and calves, and then we analysed the pods where there weren't females and calves. In the bottom right we show the raw data and then just some information on the temporal extent of those data. Then in the middle, the variable contribution plot from the model, and then the curves that were predicted from those variables that were included in the top model. Okay, so going ahead now to explain what we found. In this model, depth was the most important predictor, and what we can see in the curves down here is that for the females and calves, we had more of a peak distribution, whereas for the others, we find that it's more of a hump distribution. And you can see this in the distribution here as well. So it seems like they've got more of a restricted distribution and the others do, a more wider distribution. And again, a temperature of around 25 degrees C was preferred. And so the important areas that we found here were Camden Sound and offshore of there out to Adele Island and that area of the Tasmanian Shoals. So for the tourist operator data that spanned from 2010 to 2014, these are the results. Again, depth was the most important variable here. I'm not showing the response curves because they're almost exactly the same. So again, we can see a bit more of a restricted distribution for the females and calves, maybe not as pronounced in this example, and the area off the coast of the Dampier Peninsula being most important, but it's also picking up that area, Camden Sound and offshore to Adele Island and the Tasmanian Shoals areas we saw previously. Now the vessel surveys from 1995 to 1997. So for this one, we had sea surface temperature, not depth. That was the most important variable. And you can see that when we plot the curves that we actually get two peaks. So one around 24, 25, as we've already seen, and then another one around 26.5. And so, and this wasn't as pronounced for the females and calves. So they're preferring a warmer temperature. So it seems maybe because the pods without females and calves are using these sort of deeper shoal areas here, not so much the case for the females and calves. So, so the important areas, again, similar, the coast of the Dampier Peninsula and the Tasmanian Shoals area. So what about some validation of these data? I'm just at the early stages of looking into this. We've got some satellite tracking data that were also collected on behalf of industry. And so I've just plotted on one of these prediction maps here the satellite tracking data. Just keep in mind this is the raw data. It's very error prone, quite messy as you can see, but if you squint your eyes a bit, you can see it's doing a sort of okay job. Of course, this satellite tracking data was done in a completely different year than this survey data was collected. So we probably do have to do a bit more work on validation. But of course, the problem with this distribution modelling approach is that we don't have any effort data and we have unequal sampling coverage. And that's why we really do prefer the density surface models that I started off showing you earlier. Okay, so if you remember from the start of my talk, the other objective of the project was to advise on future monitoring of humpback whales into the future, and especially in the Lowland Garum Camden Sound Marine Park. So before we did all this modelling, I just produced this simple kernel density to see where most of the points were falling. And we identified the 25% core area of Camden Sound, and we decided that we would use that area to task the Worldview 3 satellites, because they're now at such a high resolution, 30 centimetres on the ground, that they have the potential to be able to see whales from space, which is pretty exciting. So we tasked this satellite in this area, 425 square kilometres, from early to mid-August, and we took two of them because if you end up with an image that's got cloud cover, then it's your hard luck. You still have to pay. So we took 2 images just to be sure that we were going to get some data. And lo and behold, we could see whales. And this was really exciting when Curt and I analysed this data because, we thought that we'd be able to with the resolution, but then when we really could clearly see them, it was quite amazing to be able to see these images appear. And so I thought, because it's after lunch and everyone's a little bit tired, that we might play a little game of which one of these is not like the other. Of course, it's obvious, the boat here. And you can see that boats come up really easily, and that's because boats sit on the surface all the time, so their edges can be really easily identified, whereas the whales, of course, are always partially submerged. So they're more difficult to see. So we also, before we tasked the satellite, the Worldview 3 satellite, we thought that Worldview 2 satellite might be able to do the job. And there's quite a large archive of Worldview 2 now. It has 50 centimetres on the ground resolution, not 30. And so we were able to get an archived image in our study area to use as a free trial, which was really great. We didn't have to pay anything. And I've just shown you some of the objects that we found on the surface in this image that we got. And I think from memory, it was off James Price Point. So the top 8 images, they're all boats, which is quite obvious. And then the bottom 12 images are all what we think are whales or whale related, such as footprints that are left behind when whales dive. So, of course, you probably can't go, wow, yeah, that's a whale, but maybe except this one. So we did conclude that it wasn't high enough resolution to do the job. So in summary, Kimberley is huge and it's very remote, and the surveys over the entire area are costly and time consuming, and even just in Camden Sound. Satellite imagery might be the future. It's also very costly at this stage, but it's not time consuming. You can send an email to Digital Globe, you can task the satellite, and you instantly have an image of your study area. You don't have all this organising to do, and you don't have all this analysis to do either. So Curt was the one that counted the whales in these images. So the 425 square kilometre images, he counted each one in a day. So it is quite a lot of work, and we have worked on some automated detection methods which do work very well, so that if we have larger areas, it can be more efficient at counting the whales in the sample. And of course, costs are coming down all the time. They've already launched the Worldview 4 satellite, so undoubtedly Worldview 3 will now be cheaper. And we've also worked out that we can just use a panchromatic band, which again is cheaper. But so what we found by analysing all these data sets, it's been really great to have access to them. They're clearly very powerful, and we've got them for free from industry, and it's been great to have them. But you would have obviously seen throughout my presentation that all the study areas are different. They all had different objectives. So in terms of monitoring this population into the future, what we really need is regular systematic sampling of the same area, so that we can monitor trends effectively. But we've been able to identify the core areas where habitat suitability and density was highest. The distribution and abundance was mostly driven by sea surface temperature and depth, and we found evidence that females and calves prefer shallower areas, which are clearly more protected, and this has also been found in other areas like in Hawaii. Okay, so I'll leave it there and hand over to Chandra. I'd just like to acknowledge the State Government of Western Australia and WAMSI partners for funding this research and also providing data. All the other data providers, the Centre for Whale Research, particularly Richard Costin, Impex, Woodside. I'd like to thank Curt and Michele Jenner, Lynn Irvine for the beautiful photos I've been able to show you here today, and to Ben Radford for assistance with the distribution models. Thank you.
Thanks, Michele. I think we might just save questions till the end, so we'll let Chandra have a chance to come up and do her presentation first. But I mean, this is fantastic getting to see all of these pieces of the puzzle come together somewhat in helping us understand this population. So